is a geography all its own, and Chapter 8, Curators, Controversy and Pearl Harbor, maps how the same December morning in 1941 gets reassembled differently depending on whether you're standing in landlocked Fredericksburg, Texas, on a boat approaching the Arizona Memorial, or inside a museum at a shrine in Tokyo where convicted war criminals share the roster with the honored dead. A midget submarine designated HA-19, scooped from the waters around Oahu and eventually installed in a museum built around one admiral's hometown, carries the compressed weight of that gap between artifact and the people who made it. That compression and everything it quietly leaves out is exactly where this chapter begins. Beneath the banyan's heavy shade, the morning air hangs thick with the scent of salt spray and the lingering spectral regret of last night's prawns. The headache from those questionable snacks has mostly subsided. I am left in a state of fragile contemplation suitable for tackling a heavier side of the island's history, the catastrophic failure of imagination that occurred here 80 years ago. Standing on the shoreline, where the horizon looks deceptively empty, I find myself marveling at how the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was actually a tragedy of distinct blaring alarms that multiple layers of command willfully ignored. It is an object lesson in how humans can stare directly at a flashing red light and confidently conclude it is merely a wiring short. The history of that Sunday morning functions as a detailed timeline of missed connections. Up on Oahu's north shore, the Opana radar site housed an SCR-270 unit. This mobile set of electronics looked less like a military sensor and more like a copper wire mattress rigged to catch stray radio broadcasts. At 7:02 a.m. on December 7th, Privates Joseph Lockard and George Elliott watched their oscilloscope light up. The signal was so massive it consumed the screen. They tracked this large formation of aircraft for over 30 minutes until it finally vanished into the topographical interference of the mountains at 7:39 a.m., providing a clear technological warning that offered ample time to scramble defenses. That technological advantage was immediately undone by the inertia of the command structure. The privates called in the big blip to the information center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, decided against panic. He operated under the assumption that the signal was a scheduled flight of US B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland and instructed the operators not to worry about it. Tyler's enormous public failure to act elevated a moment of routine dismissal into a permanent textbook example of how a peacetime mindset reliably converts a mechanical warning into a fatal assumption. While the airwaves were being ignored, the ocean was busy being equally disregarded. Hours before the first plane engines whined overhead, the US Navy was already fighting a war it did not know had started. At 3:42 a.m., the minesweeper USS Condor spotted a periscope near the harbor entrance, a rather distinct visual cue that something is catastrophically wrong. By 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward had engaged the localized intruder, later identified as a two-man Japanese Type A Kahoʻolawe midget submarine. The Ward fired its 4-inch gun and dropped depth charges. The ship sent a coded message up the chain stating they had fired upon and engaged a submarine. This is generally considered a straightforward admission of combat. Yet the brass on shore remained skeptical. They attributed the report to false contacts and a jittery crew, wasting over an hour of potential alert time. It was not until 2002 that deep-sea submersibles found the wreck with a 4-inch hole in the conning tower, finally proving that the Ward had been right all along. It was a "told you so" 70 years in the making. This paralysis extended all the way to the strategic level. Washington had actually sent a war warning on November 27, 1941, to Pacific commanders, including Admiral Husband E. Kimmel and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short. The message was vague enough to read like a riddle. General Short concluded the highest probability threat was local sabotage from the island's Japanese-American population rather than a naval air raid. To prevent spies from picking off airplanes individually, he ordered the aircraft to be grouped tightly together on the runways. This decision seemed perfectly prudent for anti-sabotage. Unwittingly, it arranged the planes into a dense, static target matrix for the Japanese bombers, ensuring that the consequent destruction would be incredibly efficient. Staring out at the water today, the mechanics of the disaster become glaringly clear. The defenders were not blind. They simply refused to believe what they were seeing. The sensors worked, the radar pinged, the destroyers fired, and the memos were logged. The most dangerous filter in any alert system is the human brain's ability to normalize the extraordinary. I think about this cognitive failure as I turn back toward the rental car. I slide into the driver's seat and start the engine. I shift into reverse and check my mirrors with newfound paranoia. I watch a small orange traffic cone on the backup camera screen for 10 solid seconds. Then I back directly into it. HA-19, far from Pearl Harbor. If the warning signals were ignored in 1941, the physical evidence of that morning has been treated with a similar level of chaotic disregard, scattered across the globe like spare change. It is a topographic absurdity that the National Museum of the Pacific War is not located on the sun-drenched coast of Oahu, or indeed near any body of water larger than a cattle trough, but in Fredericksburg, Texas. This is simply because it was Admiral Nimitz's hometown, a logic that implies if Neil Armstrong had been born in a swamp, NASA would launch rockets from a bog. Despite the aggressive lack of ocean, it is a fascinating world-class institution where I once stood before one of the 5 Japanese Type A Kahoʻolawe midget submarines that led the initial charge into Pearl Harbor. It is a vessel that traveled halfway around the world to run aground, get captured, and eventually retire to the German Hill Country. The geography of these 5 boats is a messy business, a tangled web of forensic salvage operations that makes my own travel itinerary look coherent. We generally assume that the debris of war stays where it falls, preserved in a solemn underwater stasis. The reality of the Pearl Harbor midget subunit is a logistical fever dream. While I looked at the hull of HA-19 in Texas, the boat piloted by Kazuo Sakamaki, who suffered a compass failure and became the war's first POW, I realized the other 4 hulls tell a darker, more confused story of the battle's underwater component. For 60 years, the first shot submarine was a ghost story. Because its fate in 1,100 feet of water was detailed by deep-sea researchers decades later, it sits at a depth that thoroughly discourages casual snorkeling. The discovery provided the ultimate, albeit delayed, "I told you so," validating a logbook entry that had been treated with skepticism for decades. Then there is the 3-piece wreck. A mystery that feels less like military history and more like an episode of CSI Honolulu. Historians argued for years over whether a midget sub actually penetrated the harbor. The answer was eventually found not in the harbor itself, but in a debris field south of Oahu. It seems the hull of boat number 16 partially succeeded, may have fired its torpedoes, and was likely effectively scuttled by its crew inside the anchorage. However, during the 1944 West Loch disaster, the Navy apparently recovered the wreck and, in a fit of wartime efficiency, dumped it at sea along with the charred remains of landing ships. It was found in 1992, broken into 3 sections, a victim of the military's out of sight, out of mind, waste management vibes. The final tally of this special attack unit is a grim checklist of displacement. 1 sub is a war grave in deep water, 1 is a scrap heap mystery solved by deep-sea robots, 1 was lost completely, and two are museum exhibits, the HA-19 in Texas, which spent the war touring on bond drives like a captive circus animal, and the Kahoʻolawe Lagoon sub, discovered in 1960. The latter was returned to Japan and resides at the Naval History Museum on Etajima, though the U.S. Navy nervously removed and dumped its armed bow section before shipping it back. Standing in the quiet, climate-controlled air of the Texas Gallery, staring at the riveted steel of a machine built for stealth and destroyed by navigation errors, I am struck by the silence of the inert metal. It sits perfectly still, thousands of miles from the ocean floor where its twin still waits in the dark, bearing the jagged, rusted puncture wound of the first American shot. Pearl Harbor, the carriers that got away. While devoting a week to inspecting a claustrophobic metal tube in a landlocked state is not as absurd as it sounds, realizing you flew entirely over the actual Pacific Ocean to see a boat in the desert is admittedly a questionable use of frequent flyer miles. Yet that Texas exhibit perfectly captures the dislocated reality of December 7, 1941. The HA-19 submarine failed on arrival, but back in the frantic pre-dawn darkness off Oahu, the Japanese fleet was busy proving that bureaucracy is often more dangerous than torpedoes. The initial surprise of the attack was achieved less through phantom-like stealth and more through a comedy of procedural errors. At 6:45 a.m., the destroyer USS Ward fired the first shots of the Pacific War, sinking a midget submarine near the harbor entrance. Although that kill was finally confirmed by a ballistic match in 2002, the initial report was met with profound skepticism and died in the chain of command. Less than 20 minutes later, two privates at the Opana radar site stared at a massive blip representing an incoming air armada, only to be told by a lieutenant at Fort Shafter not to worry. He was operating on the delightfully optimistic assumption that the blip was just a scheduled flight of B-17 from the mainland. The result of this administrative lethargy was that the Japanese strike force arrived to find a fleet at peace, achieving a tactical masterpiece that killed 2,403 Americans, including 68 civilians, and wounded another 1,178. The carnage was specific and heavy. The Imperial Japanese Navy managed to sink or damage 21 ships, turning the battleships Arizona and Oklahoma into total losses, while temporarily removing the West Virginia, California, and Nevada from the board. They also smashed 188 aircraft, mostly while the planes sat parked neatly wingtip to wingtip on the ground. However, in a twist of luck that suggests the universe harbors a bias toward naval aviation, the three Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers were absent. The USS Enterprise was delivering aircraft to Wake Island, the USS Lexington was operating near Midway, and the USS Saratoga was undergoing upkeep in San Diego. Their absence meant the U.S. Navy's primary offensive capability survived the morning entirely by accident. The attack's leadership then made a decision that likely saved the American war effort in the long term. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the task force, opted to withdraw his fleet after just 2 waves. Deciding to retreat early is a defensible military choice when lingering risks a counterstrike from unaccounted-for American dive bombers. But leaving the enemy's entire fuel supply intact effectively spared the Americans from strategic exile. By cancelling a 3rd wave, Nagumo preserved the dry docks, machine shops, and 4.5 million barrels of oil stored in above-ground tanks, which provided the infrastructure that eventually allowed the Pacific Fleet to repair its wounded ships locally rather than retreating to California. Nagumo had his reasons, citing a laundry list of concerns that reads like a risk assessment compiled by an anxious actuary. He did not know the locations of the American carriers. He felt the element of surprise was thoroughly exhausted, and he was terrified of attempting night landings, which in 1941 were a highly effective way to lose pilots to gravity rather than gunfire. He also worried about the fuel logistics for his screening destroyers. Despite subordinates arguing that burning the oil tanks would cripple the US Navy for years, Nagumo insisted the task force had achieved its objectives. Vice Admiral Nagumo proved to be the kind of commander who double-checks the stove is off before looting a burning house, refuses to merge onto the highway without a written invitation, and ends the company holiday party at 8:30 p.m. to avoid a noise complaint, a level of meticulous caution that an exasperated Imperial High Command eventually decided was best suited for a slightly less critical assignment. Black tears at the USS Arizona. Consolidating the gastronomic and logistical indignities of the previous evening into a sort of grim armor, I approached the Pearl Harbor National Memorial not merely as a tourist, but as a battle-hardened veteran of the American vacation. The questionable prawns and cereal-flavored ice cream had forged a constitution of iron. It proved a necessary trait for navigating the modern iteration of this historic site. I have made this pilgrimage at least 3 times over the years, and my memory clings to a simpler era when one could stroll onto the boat with the casual dignity of a person unburdened by federal paranoia. Those days are dead. The current visitor center operates with the welcoming spirit of a black site interrogation facility. Before we could even contemplate honoring the fallen, we had to surrender all bags and valuables to a locker system, stripping ourselves of our worldly goods like monks entering a particularly litigious monastery. The logistical hurdles continued with the discovery that the casual drive onto the base to visit the USS Missouri is also a relic of the past. On a previous visit, seemingly a lifetime ago before my wedding, my parents and I had motored onto the facility without triggering a tactical alert. Emboldened by this obsolete knowledge, I steered our rental car toward what I assumed was the correct entrance, only to discover that it is alarmingly easy to accidentally attempt an invasion of an active military installation. We were promptly intercepted by military police who looked upon our navigational incompetence with the stony, unblinking judgment of a sphinx. As we were turned around, I reflected on the irony that 70 years prior, the base had struggled to identify actual threats, yet they had no trouble spotting a confused tourist in a compact sedan. Once we navigated the remaining gauntlet of modern security and actually reached the USS Arizona Memorial, the administrative headaches vanished. The site retains a heavy, undeniable gravity. Below the white structure, the wreckage of the battleship weeps oil into the harbor, a phenomenon known as the Black Tears. Watching that slick bubble up from the dark hull where over 1,000 men are entombed creates a visceral connection to the past. The leaking fuel points directly to the resource that dictated the entire conflict. Nagumo spared the American oil tanks in 1941, but by the war's end, it was Japan that had run dry. This specific irony brought to mind a previous excursion to Gifu, Japan, where I toured the sites where the Zero fighter planes were manufactured. The logistical reality of the Japanese war effort in its final, desperate stages was tragically absurd. The factory was located miles away from the airfield, and the empire that had once struck with such terrifying precision had been reduced to a state of fuel-starved improvisation. Lacking gasoline to transport their high-performance aircraft by truck, they hitched the pinnacle of aviation engineering to oxen, slow, plodding beef tractors, to drag the killing machines over a mountain pass. Standing over the Arizona, observing the plentiful oil still leaking from an American ship sunk 8 decades ago, the image of those planes being towed by livestock felt like a grim punchline to a long, terrible joke about industrial capacity. Nihao zeroes in on Pearl Harbor. With that image of livestock-powered aviation lingering as a fitting mental appetizer, we sought sanctuary in the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum on Ford Island. The facility promised to be both a dynamic celebration of flight and a static repository of dead things. It fulfilled these contradictory prophecies simultaneously through a hyper-literal interpretation of space, taking the form of a hangar under active renovation. Here, the thrill of flight met the stillness of death in a deeply anticlimactic manner. We found a dusty, cavernous room full of helicopters ranging from a modern Kiowa to an aging F-111, all grounded in a permanent state of maintenance and looking like they were waiting for parts that were never going to arrive. The hangar offered a necessary distraction from the heavy, oil-streaked waters of the memorial below. It houses an eclectic collection, including a plane from the Doolittle Raiders and several newer aircraft in various stages of undress. Yet among the aluminum and rivets, one exhibit anchors the visitor to a story so bizarre it feels like ripped pages from a mid-century pulp magazine. It centers on the wreckage of a Mitsubishi A6M20 and an event known as the Niihau Affair, a violent struggle that played out on a privately owned island while the rest of the world stared at the smoke rising over Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Airman First Class Shigenori Nishikaichi was flying off the carrier Hiryu when he found himself in a predicament not covered in the standard flight manuals. His plane sustained damage during the attack, forcing him to crash land on Niihau. The residents there had no radios. Living in blissful ignorance of the morning's carnage, they treated him with the hospitality due a guest who drops out of the sky. However, an observant ranch hand named Hawila Kaleohano noticed the pilot's agitation, feeling a twitch in his jaw and a tightening in his gut. Without a word, Kaleohano instinctively snatched the aviator's pistol and his papers, seizing maps and codes the Japanese military would perceive as a do-not-share list of highest importance. The situation quickly devolved into a grim comedy of errors. News of the Pearl Harbor attack eventually reached the island via a battery-operated radio, but the pilot's escape route was severed by bureaucracy. A strict wartime boat ban imposed by the U.S. Navy prevented the island's weekly supply vessel from arriving. This restriction inadvertently trapped the pilot and the residents together in a high-stakes quarantine. Desperate to destroy the evidence of his failure, Nishikaichi recruited Yoshio Harada, a local Japanese resident, to his cause. When the two men could not bully Kaleohano into returning the documents, they escalated to arson and armed robbery. They torched the Zero, then took hostages using a shotgun and the downed plane's machine gun. The standoff concluded on December 13th with a confrontation that strained the limits of biology. Ben Kanahaley and his wife, Ella, stood against the armed pilot. Nishikaichi shot Ben 3 times. A normal man would have fallen. Ben Kanahaley simply got angry. Ben picked up the pilot, a trained military aviator, and slammed him into a stone wall with the finality of a judge swinging a gavel. Ella joined the fray, striking the pilot with a rock, and Ben ended the struggle with a knife. The pilot was dead, and in the tragic aftermath, his accomplice Harada took his own life. Ben Kanahaley recovered. He went on to receive the Medal for Merit and a Purple Heart, a rare distinction for a civilian doing the government's work with his bare hands. The wreckage of the Zero was salvaged, and today remnants like the wing frame and engine manifold sit in the Ford Island Museum as physical evidence of a week where the global conflict came to a frantic, personal close on a lonely island, an incident historians still argue over regarding its role in driving the demand for Japanese-American internment. Looking at the twisted metal of the Zero, I considered the legacy of the incident. It was a narrative where the prophecy that the war would reach every corner of America and the prophecy that local heroes would rise to defend their homes were both fulfilled by a highly literal interaction. A rancher threw a pilot into a wall. It was a chaotic, violent and messy resolution, proving that history is not always written by generals or treaties. Sometimes it is written by a guy named Ben who really did not appreciate houseguests shooting at him. Yasukuni, where memory marches in silence. The twisted wreckage of the Niihau Zero on Ford Island provided a stark contrast to the machines we encountered across the Pacific. In 2024, having finished our circumambulation of the Tokyo Imperial Palace, a site of such aggressive tranquility it practically dares you to be stressed, we decided to engage in a modern ritual of financial self-immolation. We summoned a chariot. Utilizing the TaxiGo app, a piece of software that functions like Uber but with white-gloved drivers and doors that open automatically with the eerie grace of a haunted house, we embarked on what would become a recurring theme of our Japanese odyssey, the liquidation of our retirement savings, 1 metered kilometer at a time. By the trip's end, we had poured over $1,000 into the local taxi economy. It was a well-spent fortune that allowed our wallets to feel the crushing weight of history just as acutely as our minds did. Our destination was the Yasukuni Museum, located within the leafy, calibrated solemnity of the Yasukuni Shrine. The facility acts as an international friction point for memory and diplomacy. The shrine operates as the heavy spiritual varsity jacket of Japan's military soul, dedicated to the kami, or spirits, of 2.5 million people who died for the emperor. This includes a roster of everyday soldiers, nurses and students, but also, owing to a clerical maneuver in 1978 that remains strictly off the Christmas card list for China and South Korea, 1,068 convicted war criminals. 14 of those were Class A. Approaching the entrance, we were greeted by a sign that operated less as a welcome mat and more as a preemptive strike against discourse. It explicitly requested visitors to refrain from lecturing or explaining and to maintain silence. To ask a father to walk through a military history museum without explaining things to his family is like asking a French philosopher to briefly refrain from smoking. It is an ontological crisis. The sign weaponized the cultural expectation of polite communal silence against the Western tourist's biological imperative to be a loud, walking Wikipedia. Inside, the Yasukuni presents a pristine, hermetically sealed vision of the past. The physical artifacts are undeniable in their terrifying majesty. The centerpiece is a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, restored to a polish so deep you could see the reflection of your own conflicted conscience in the fuselage. It is a machine of pure aesthetic beauty designed solely for kinetic violence, standing in total contrast to the twisted scrap metal we had analyzed at Pearl Harbor. While the artifacts speak of engineering prowess, the placards speak of a specific, curated reality. Since its establishment in 1882, the Yasukuni has served as the primary repository for Japan's martial heritage. The narrative arc presented within its walls treats the darker chapters of the 20th century with the narrative equivalent of a blurred selfie. The exhibits frame Japan's expansion into Asia as a crusade for liberation from Western colonialism. The Greater East Asia War, as it is termed here, is depicted as a noble, defensive struggle for survival. Events that dominate the history books of neighboring nations, such as the Nanking Massacre or the systematic exploitation of comfort women, are notably absent. They are either treated as static on the line or smoothed over with vague euphemisms about the harsh necessities of conflict. The museum operates on the premise that if you do not write it down on a placard, it did not, metaphysically speaking, happen. This edited version of events transforms the defeat of 1945 into something else entirely. In the logic of the Yasukuni, the devastating public setback of losing the war, the total material and military collapse of the empire, was alchemized into a spiritual victory. By stripping the conflict of its atrocities and reframing the soldiers solely as martyrs who sacrificed themselves for the preservation of the national polity, the loss itself became the irreplaceable currency for the shrine's most profound power. The crushing defeat provided the necessary tragedy to elevate the dead from mere soldiers into inviolable deities, granting the institution a defensive shield of sacred sorrow that no amount of diplomatic protest can seemingly pierce. That operating logic of sacred engineered sacrifice was bolted directly into the museum's other major artifact. Sitting near the pristine Zero was a chiton, a human torpedo fashioned from a modified submarine engine with a seat attached. It offered a one-way ticket for a pilot whose primary navigation tool was desperation. Chiton. Courage trapped inside a torpedo. Standing directly before the long black cylinder that redefined the concept of a bad commute, the forced quiet of the museum hung heavy over the collection of steel. In the desperate depths of late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy found itself backed into a strategic corner no amount of maneuvering could resolve. The result was this 48-foot weapon, officially named Katon, or Return to Heaven, a poetic euphemism for a subaquatic coffin designed to ensure its operator never returned anywhere terrestrial. Grafted onto a conventional torpedo propulsion engine, the weapon was modified to carry a single pilot. These operators were typically young men, barely out of their teens, fueled by high-octane nationalism and sealed inside a cockpit so cramped it made a standard wartime submarine berth feel expansive. The operational premise of the chiton was a grim testament to the era's peak bad ideas. Launched from the crushing darkness beneath the sea by a host submarine, the pilot was tasked with steering this primitive submersible toward an Allied vessel. The controls were rudimentary, visibility was akin to looking through mud, and the survival rate was mathematically zero. While the program did claim the oiler USS Mississinawa, the overall strategic impact was negligible. The project sparked intense, quiet debates within the Navy, pitting the ethical migraine of wasting life against the demand for a noble sacrifice. Even some pilots harbored private doubts about the morality of their one-way ticket, though dissent was a luxury the conflict did not afford them. Looking at the preserved metal carcass, I attempted to commune with the gravity of the moment. It was a difficult task, primarily because my current level of physical discomfort, a slight pinched nerve from our exorbitant taxi rides, was pitifully trivial. I tried to imagine the claustrophobia of the training simulators, described by historians as glorified sardine cans, and found my modern constitution failing. I possess the sort of bravery that allows me to send back lukewarm soup. The notion of navigating a blind torpedo into the hull of a destroyer required a calibration of willpower I simply do not have. It was a jarring juxtaposition. I was an American tourist quietly stressing over a mounting Tokyo transport bill, staring at a machine built for a teenager whose currency was his own existence. The exhibit pulled together threads we had been following for days, stretching from the beaches of Oahu to this quiet hall in Chiyoda. Beside the chiton sat the pristine Mitsubishi A6M0. By the end of the conflict, fuel shortages in Japan were so severe that these pinnacles of aviation engineering were reportedly dragged from factories to airfields by oxen. It was a humiliated fusion of ancient agriculture and modern warfare. The chiton represented the naval equivalent of that desperation, a hybrid of mechanical ingenuity and human fatalism preserved under fluorescent lights. We exited the hall, the physical weight of the history lesson pressed down as surely as the atmospheric pressure on a submerged hull. The silence requested by the museum had been respectfully maintained, but the internal noise was deafening. Checking the TaxiGo app for the next leg of our journey, we watched the fare estimate load with a familiar sense of inevitability. The financial cost of navigating Tokyo was steep, yet looking back at the heavy doors of the Yushukan, it was clear the price of the memories housed inside had exacted a much higher toll, an ideological debt that rippled far beyond the city and violently reshaped the islands we had just left behind. Pearl Harbor blackout, Hawaii under martial law. Under the lingering weight of the suicide torpedoes and a mounting Tokyo taxi fare, The narrative timeline of the trip lurched backward from the desperate end of the war to its catastrophic beginning. It was a tonal shift that hit with the subtlety of a falling piano. The kaiten represented a slow, suffocating dread. By contrast, the events initiated by the Imperial Japanese Navy on December 7, 1941, possessed a sudden kinetic violence that shattered the peacetime illusion in a matter of minutes. One moment, Oahu was a territory of cane fields and slow-moving Sundays. The next, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier-borne aircraft were turning Pearl Harbor into an inferno, killing 2,403 Americans and crippling the Pacific Fleet. The sheer scale of the raid jolted the islands into a reality that felt less like an isolated Pacific outpost and more like the front lines of a global collapse. If the attack was the punch, the government's reaction was the handcuffs. Within hours, martial law was declared. Civilian courts were sidelined in favor of military provost tribunals that handled everything from labor disputes to jaywalking. It was a total suspension of standard civic procedures, replaced by a legal framework running purely on army orders. This state of affairs lasted until October 24, 1944. The Supreme Court eventually ruled in Duncan versus Kahanamoku, 1946, that using military tribunals for civilians was unconstitutional once the immediate danger passed. By then, however, the islands had spent nearly 3 years governed first by Walter Short and then Delos C. Emmons. Thinking back to our quiet pandemic-era walk through those restored royal rooms, the physical reality of this takeover was nowhere more apparent than at Iolani Palace. Having already served as a prison for Queen Liliuokalani decades earlier, the building was commandeered as a nerve center for the martial law administration. Its throne room grandeur was repurposed for the gritty business of censorship and supply logistics. It is hard to miss the irony of a democracy crying havoc and immediately turning a former royal residence into a military bunker. Confinement in Hawaii took a different shape than the sprawling, dusty barracks of the mainland. Here, the geography dictated smaller, hidden sites like the Honouliuli National Historic Site. Locals called it Hell Valley, which is exactly the sort of branding that suggests you should pack plenty of water. Tucked into a gulch, it held a bizarre demographic mix of roughly 400 civilian internees and 4,000 prisoners of war. It became an enforced international mixer where Korean, Okinawan, Italian, and German prisoners navigated confinement alongside Japanese nationals. That heavy ratio of POWs to civilians reflected Hawaii's role as a forward combat zone rather than a mainland relocation hub. Reading through the historical accounts of university students from that era, I asked myself a question that rarely comes up when I am getting annoyed at a slow resort elevator. Would I have the backbone to fight for a country that had effectively just put my entire neighborhood in a timeout? For the students at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the answer was a defiant positive. Though initially barred from service and stripped of their weapons, they formed the Varsity Victory Volunteers. This group of just 169 local men did the grunt work of breaking rocks and stringing wire until the military finally relented. They became the feeder stream for the 100th Infantry Battalion and the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team, units that fought across Italy and France to become some of the most decorated in history. That legacy remains visible today. Several ROTC cadets who were denied commissions in 1941 were eventually posthumously promoted in Honolulu, receiving rank long after they could physically return a salute. For those outside the military ranks, the home front meant a radical rewriting of domestic life. Residents dealt with strict rationing, price controls, and the universal indignity of fingerprinting. The blackout regulations were the strictest in American history, turning the nightlife of Honolulu into a pitch-black void every evening. Roughly 1 million service members cycled through the islands. The local economy was force-fed defense payrolls until it completely transformed from agriculture to military infrastructure. It is tempting to assume that the moment the war ended, everyone simply tore down the barbed wire, reinstated the civilian judges, and went back to growing pineapples. However, you cannot easily unravel 3 years of total war. The infrastructure built for defense became the heavy foundation of the modern Hawaiian economy. The cane fields that once hid bunkers eventually gave way to the deep urban sprawl, setting the stage for our current Honolulu traffic jams. The blackout ended, but the lights that came back on illuminated a very different set of islands. What Chapter 8 makes clear is that the distance between an event and its memorial is never neutral. Whether it's a landlocked Texas museum, a shrine in Tokyo, or oil still bleeding from a wreck in a harbor, every curatorial choice is also an argument about what the past means and who gets to say so. The wry footnote is that the most honest exhibit in any of these places might be that slow, persistent oil slick, which has been making its own unedited statement for over 80 years without a single interpretive placard. Next up, the chapter closes on something lighter, or at least more expensive, as Lānaʻi offers a different kind of curation, the billionaire-owned, resort-polished, gecko-haunted variety, and it's worth asking whether a curated paradise is really all that different from a curated past. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Something shifts when a war museum gives way to a resort island, and Chapter 9 of The Rise the Limit, titled Wagyu, Ospreys, and Lānaʻi's Gold Dust Gecko, makes that transition without pretending the contrast is anything but strange. Last chapter traced a heavy arc through Pearl Harbor Memorials, a landlocked Texas museum, and Yasukuni's contested galleries, where memory, omission, and distance kept complicating each other. Now the narrator lands on Lānaʻi, a privately consolidated island where a military Osprey runs touch-and-go drills over the same coastline that feeds into Four Seasons grounds, gecko sightings, and an omakase Wagyu dinner at Nobu. Curated comfort and visible infrastructure keep colliding in ways the resort brochure definitely did not plan for. Social rituals often fail to account for the inexplicable friction of commerce, a phenomenon I observed with keen academic detachment while standing on the asphalt of the rental car return lane. The agent, a man functioning within a bureaucratic framework impenetrable to outsiders, levied a charge against my account totaling exactly $1. I analyzed the variables: fuel levels, tire tread, the relative sheen of the bumper. None of these correlated to this financial penalty. It appeared to be a ceremonial tithe, a symbolic offering to the gods of logistics required to sever the bond between driver and vehicle. I did not query the officiating priest regarding his theology. I simply paid the dollar, accepting my role as the bewildered patron in a confusing economic rite. Shedding the rental contract allowed the journey to ascend into the realm of the truly rarefied. A shuttle ferried us to the private terminal for Lānaʻi Air. We boarded a Cessna Caravan, an aircraft that felt less like public transport and more like a personal favor. Before departure, we spotted one final incongruity on the horizon. A fleet of small helicopters sat painted in the exact livery as the one from Magnum PY, ostensibly available for tours. Did I immediately look at my reflection and consider growing a mustache to complete the fantasy? Yes, I absolutely did. The waiting area offered a tableau of geopolitical complexity. On the floor, a gentleman was performing Muslim prayers with devout precision. Ethnically, he appeared Chinese, yet once he rose, he began issuing directives in fluent Russian to a sprawling entourage that included a nanny and 5 children. I attempted to perform the cultural calculus required to solve this equation and determined we were in the presence of an Uzbek family. I have never encountered an Uzbek in the wild before. I considered it a silent diplomatic victory for international relations that we were all drinking the same complimentary water. Our Cessna lifted over the channel. I am statistically confident I witnessed a whale breaching the surface, although from 2,000 feet one must concede it could have been a piece of driftwood with grand aspirations. We descended toward the dramatic cliffs of Lānaʻi, a topography that suggests nature was in a particularly dramatic mood when it laid the foundations. Just as our bags transferred to a waiting vehicle, a military Osprey tiltrotor aircraft roared into the frame to execute aggressive touch-and-go landings. It was a loud, violent piece of machinery. The sheer force of its rotors contrasted sharply with the engineered tranquility we were about to enter, offering a brief glimpse of the strategic military framework operating just above these isolated resort coastlines. Lānaʻi City is a small grid of buildings that feels larger than physics should allow, perhaps because the entire island operates as the personal fiefdom of Larry Ellison. The billionaire secured vast tracts of land and established 2 Four Seasons properties here, sparing no expense in an effort to intimidate guests with sheer aesthetic force. Entering the main ahupua'a of the hotel, one is immediately subjected to the gaze of a Jeff Koons statue of Aphrodite. Reliable sources informed me that this shiny pink stainless steel confection is valued somewhere between $10 and $25 million. That is a massive volume of currency to exchange for something that looks like it belongs on the dashboard of a galactic cruiser, yet it commands the room with an undeniable reflective authority. A short walk away rests a colossal head sculpted by Jaume Plensa, an artist whose work I was previously unfamiliar with, which is entirely my failing. The piece resembles a giant Olmec statue subjected to a hydraulic vise and compressed into a singular plane of existence. It is haunting and magnificent. The surrounding grounds are manicured with such militant precision that I suspect the gardeners use laser levels. I even discovered a bookshelf curated with titles featuring my favorite typefaces, a hyper-specific thrill that validates my entire existence. We also located a banyan tree looking suspiciously like the spirit tree from Avatar, alongside a pool that functions more as a man-made freshwater sea surrounded by hot tubs. A gold dust gecko, a handsome specimen who clearly understood he was the true owner of the property, paused to allow me to admire his emerald scales. We concluded the day at Nobu, a structure so architecturally striking it demands you improve your posture just to walk through the door. We committed to the omakase tasting menu. It is a decision that usually involves a high degree of trust in strangers. The lobster salad was technically proficient, but the Wagyu beef was an epical event. It was not merely meat. It was a revelation. It proved so tender and flavorful that it rendered all previous steaks I have consumed into disappointing misunderstandings, treating them as mere biological failures compared to this triumphant synthesis of fat and muscle. The dessert, however, brought me crashing back to earth. I do not understand the global conspiracy to pretend strictly pulverized tea leaves are a treat. The matcha tasted of sweetened lawn clippings. Salvation arrived only in the form of a scoop of passion fruit ice cream. Exhausted by the rigorous demands of luxury, we retreated to the room. I remain privately convinced that the compressed Plensa head outside was actually a prop salvaged from the television show Lost, though I lack the evidentiary standard to prove this in a court of law. Harbors, headquarters, and Hawaii's hidden hand-heading. Even cocooned in our room, away from the billionaire kingpin and his shiny pink statues, my thoughts kept circling back to that lone Osprey we had seen earlier. While the aircraft looked cinematic banking against the Lānaʻi cliffs, it was merely a commuter from the true landlord of the archipelago, the United States Department of Defense. There is perhaps no state in America with a more conspicuous military footprint. This visual dominance ranges from giant X-band radars perched on oil platforms like villainous golf balls to the constant hum of rotary wings. Hawaii is the designated geographical sacrificial lamb, placed on the map to go up in smoke first if global diplomacy ever takes a day off. The reality of this position became terrifyingly tangible a few years ago. An alert flashed across phones statewide. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. It triggered a moment of panicked absurdity. Fathers engaged in the heroic, if futile, act of throwing their children into storm sewers. Tourists wept in bathtubs. People prepared to meet their maker. In the end, the incoming fire was purely algorithmic. A misclick on a bureaucrat's screen turned the nerve center of the Pacific into an epicenter of anxiety. That nerve center operates high above Honolulu at Camp H.M. Smith, the headquarters of the United States Indo-Pacific Command. Originally built as a naval hospital, the facility rests on a secure perch chosen for its sweeping line-of-sight communications. The placement confirms that while global command relies on satellites and silence, it still hinges on who controls the local topography. From this former hospital, commanders manage security from the California coast all the way to India. It is a jurisdiction so vast it makes the Roman Empire look like a homeowners association. This sprawling authority explains the dense chain of bases cluttering the map, stretching from the historic docks of Pearl Harbor to the upland ranges of Schofield Barracks and the Pacific Missile Range facility. The economics of this military enterprise permeate the state. Recent reporting pegs defense activity at roughly 9% of Hawaii's $112 billion gross domestic product, with about 73,000 service members and civilians tethered to that federal payroll. These numbers ripple outward through construction, retail, and port logistics. The islands effectively operate as a beautiful timeshare, split between vacationers seeking mai tais and admirals seeking deterrence. This dual occupancy becomes unavoidable during the summer, when the RIMPAC exercise turns the ocean into a congested parking lot for coalition navies. What began during the Cold War with a handful of allied navies has swollen into a massive maritime convention. In 2024, 29 nations sent 40 ships, 3 submarines, over 150 aircraft, and some 25,000 personnel to use Hawaiian waters for combat coordination. It is a rehearsal for keeping sea lanes open, but it also functions as a localized economic stimulus package for shipyards and regional distributors. Residents see the financial upside in federal contracts, yet they endure the traffic, the noise, and the strain on public services required to host the world's primary Pacific proving ground. Land remains the most contentious currency. The Department of Defense controls roughly 5 to 6% of the state's total acreage. This sounds like a rounding error until one remembers the state is a collection of small volcanic peaks where every buildable acre carries astronomical value. Courts and boards have recently pressed for tighter stewardship, ranging from rulings by the Hawaii Supreme Court over Kahoʻolawe management to local resistance against extending army leases. Supporters argue the high-altitude range is irreplaceable for readiness, providing the essential terrain to simulate war without starting one, while critics counter that cultural sites and local ecosystems have subsidized that readiness for generations. When the military eventually relinquishes acreage, the afterlife of the soil matters enormously. A 2022 parcel on Molokai reverted to the Department of Hawaiian Homelands only after extensive cleanup, demonstrating that former defense sites can eventually support agriculture or cultural restoration, provided the remediation is thorough. Water, however, forced the debate from abstract legal wrangling to an urgent crisis at Red Hill. The World War II-era fuel facility, an engineering marvel of tanks hidden deep within volcanic rock, operated under contradictory expectations. Engineers claimed the site was an invulnerable fortress of resilience that would outlast any enemy, while modern regulators demanded a pristine facility that would never harm the watershed. In 2021, physics resolved the tension. The invulnerable tanks leaked fuel directly into the Navy's own water system, demonstrating that nothing built for mass conflict generates safety for the environment without strict oversight. Washington ordered the defueling and permanent closure. With the fuel drained, the long-term cleanup continues. The crisis demonstrated that infrastructure built for 1940s warfare becomes a modern liability the moment geology channels leaks into the drinking supply. Housing remains the everyday pressure point where grand strategy meets the grocery bill. On Oahu, military housing allowances collide with a constrained supply, pushing rents in civilian neighborhoods upward and stirring calls for more base-built family units. Elected officials who value federal jobs are now asking the Pentagon to shoulder more of the local cost. Retiring for the night on Lānaʻi, we looked out toward the darkened coast, imagining the layers of history that stack on top of one another: ancient voyagers, sugar barons, and modern destroyers. The islands are a place of immense beauty, but they also function as a fortress, resting on a restless hotspot that demands both readiness and rent. Wiki, Hawaiian words gone global. Even the vocabularies of paradise have been engineered and drafted into service. I looked out from the hotel terrace, a specific architectural feature that real estate agents globally have co-opted as a Lānaʻi, and considered how the tourism industry exported syllables as aggressively as it exported pineapples and sugar. I spent the morning looking for authenticity in a resort physically blasted out of coral by explosives. But the more enduring cultural excavation actually happened in the dictionary. While developers were busy shaping the coastline, the English language was busy colonizing Hawaiian words, stripping them of their nuance, packing them in suitcases, and shipping them off to the mainland to live new, slightly confused lives. The most famous stowaway is wiki. Most people assume it is a digitally native term invented by a silence-loving librarian, but it is a loanword meaning quick. In 1994, software developer Ward Cunningham found himself at the Honolulu airport, riding the inter-terminal bus known as the Wiki Shuttle, a rattling, diesel-fumed latency limousine that promised speed but mostly delivered humidity. Inspired by the bus's optimistic name, he dubbed his new collaborative software the WikiWeb, ensuring that the global accumulation of human knowledge would be forever etymologically linked to an airport transfer service. This linguistic trade route goes both ways. Consider the mu'umu'u, literally meaning cut off. The word originally described a loose gown lacking a full yoke or train. It evolved from the Mother Hubbard dresses introduced by 19th-century missionaries who were scandalized by skin and determined to drape the population in cotton sacks. Over time, the garment mutated from a tool of puritanical concealment into the floral aloha wear staple of leisure, achieving a level of comfort that fashion usually forbids. I picked up a brochure for a ukulele lesson, holding another export that lost its dignity in translation. The word ukulele refers to the instrument developed here from Portuguese prototypes like the braguinha in the late 19th century. However, the literal translation is jumping flea, a nod to the player's flying fingers rather than the infestation status of the wood. It sits comfortably in the lexicon alongside lei, hula, and luau, words that managed to cross the Pacific with their definitions largely intact, serving as direct descriptors for the garland, the dance, and the feast where I would inevitably eat too much pork. Other terms suffered stranger fates. Kahuna, originally a term of immense respect for an expert, priest, or master craftsman like a healer, migrated into American slang via surf culture and bad Hollywood scripts. It became the Big Kahuna, a phrase now associated less with sacred knowledge and more with a fictional burger joint in a Tarantino movie or a middle manager trying to sound cool at a corporate retreat. Similarly, kapu, referring to the strict system of sacred prohibitions and laws in ancient Hawaii and linguistically tied to the Tongan taboo, has been reduced by resort signage to a polite suggestion meaning keep out or employees only, usually taped to a door hiding a mop bucket. The botanical world hasn't escaped this rebranding. In the lobby, I admired the orchids, knowing that enthusiasts worldwide now use the Hawaiian word keiki, or child, to describe a baby plant or clone produced asexually. It is a sweet adoption, much gentler than the corporate appropriation of ohana. Derived from oha, the shoot of the taro plant, ohana signifies family in a way that creates a shared ancestry between people and the land. Thanks to the Lilo and Stitch franchise, it entered the global vernacular as a catchphrase often printed on T-shirts worn by people screaming at flight attendants, sparking complex debates about who exactly gets to define the boundaries of cultural inclusion. Standing there, listening to the distant surf, I felt like a master linguist. I was a decoder of civilizations, holding the semantic history of the Pacific in my mind, ready to bridge the gap between ancient tradition and modern usage with a single utterance. I turned to my wife and confidently pointed at the sign by the pool. "That says kapu," I explained with grave seriousness, "which means if we go in there we are violating the sacred laws of the gods." She looked at me, then at the pictogram of the maintenance closet, and said, "It means they're cleaning the toilet, Shakespeare." It was a swift, necessary puncture to my professorial posturing. Stripping language of its weight is an occupational hazard of leisure. Yet beyond the resort fence, away from the translated brochures and the corporate branding, the Hawaiian language was already busy doing much heavier lifting, rescued by a generation that refused to let its syllables fade into mere decor. Hokulea and Hawaii's Renaissance at Sea. Ua mauke ea oka aina ika pono. Kamehameha III. Given the speed with which the semantic souvenir shop of the last century exported words like wiki and ukulele to the rest of the world, one might have expected the islands to run out of cultural inventory entirely. Yet, as the jet age turned the archipelago into a postcard of manicured escapism, a countercurrent began to form in the 1970s, a decade usually associated elsewhere with disco and questionable knitwear. In Hawaii, this era marked a profound internal retrieval known as the Second Hawaiian Renaissance. Locals stopped acting as background extras in a tourist production and reclaimed the director's chair. They used the very elements of their environment, primarily song and sea, as tools of resistance against decades of American homogenization. The soundtrack for this revival required a deliberate pivot away from the commercialized slide guitar kitsch that had become the elevator music of paradise. The Renaissance found its voice in keat hoalu, or slack key guitar. It was a discipline where tunings were historically guarded with the fervent paranoia usually found in disputes over a wealthy relative's will. For generations, families protected their specific sonic signatures as proprietary secrets. But in a moment of cultural triage during the 60s and 70s, masters like Raymond Kane and Gabi Pahenui broke protocol to stem the loss. They began teaching these private domestic arts publicly. This shift transformed music from mere poolside entertainment into a vehicle for historical continuity. A new generation began composing mele that documented political history and specific wahipana, or legendary places, proving that a song could be a land deed if you listened hard enough. This reclamation of history extended from the fretboard to the horizon line with the launch of the Kahoʻolawe in 1976. Navigators built the double-hulled voyaging canoe to test a hypothesis that struck at the core of Polynesian capability. It is easy to assume that sailing across the largest ocean on Earth without a sextant, compass, or GPS is merely a high-stakes form of aquatic gambling, a desperate roll of the dice in a watery void. However, the voyage to Tahiti dismantled the prevailing drift theory, the insulting academic notion that ancient Polynesians had populated the Pacific largely by accident, bumping into islands like confused pinballs. Guided by Micronesian master Mau Piailug, the crew used the star compass and ocean swells to prove that ancestors were intentional, sophisticated navigators. The journey turned the ocean from a blank barrier into a known geography. If the canoe proved a mastery of the ocean, the political focus landed heavily on the soil, specifically the battered earth of Kahoʻolawe. The U.S. Navy had been using the island as a live-fire target range since World War II, a practice largely incompatible with quiet reflection. The cultural energy of the 70s hardened into a sharp political edge known as aloha aina, or love of the land. Activists occupied Kahoʻolawe to demand an end to the bombing, transforming the island from a ballistic testing ground into a sacred cause. This pressure fueled the 1978 Constitutional Convention, which created the Office of Hawaiian Affairs to manage lands for native Hawaiians, signaling a transition from protest to the sober machinery of institutional governance. Was this renaissance simply a rejection of the modern world in favor of a romanticized past? Hardly. It was a necessary recalibration of navigational instruments. By reviving the secret tunings and the celestial pathways, the movement reasserted that Hawaiian culture was not a static relic to be dusted off for visitors, but a living, adapting system capable of plotting a course through a complex modern reality. And inevitably, that course pointed squarely back into the cratered landscape of Kahoʻolawe to confront the physical toll of that reality. Kahoʻolawe, from bombs to belonging. Confronting that cratered physical reality requires looking south from Maui toward the smallest major island and asking an uncomfortable geographical question. How exactly did a navigational university dedicated to an ocean god become a favored spot for high explosives? If the cultural renaissance of the 1970s was the spiritual software update Hawaii frantically needed, Kahoʻolawe was the hardware that had been horrifyingly bricked. While musicians reclaimed the secret tunings of the slack key guitar and navigators rebuilt their traditional voyaging paths, this red dust island struggled to reclaim its actual physical surface from a century of spectacular mismanagement. To understand why activists were willing to die for a dry rock, one must understand that it was not always a dry rock. Historically, Kahoʻolawe was the physical embodiment, or kinolau, of Kanaloa, the god of the ocean, a deity who presumably takes a dim view of being used for aerial target practice. Sitting in the rain shadow of Maui's massive Haleakala volcano, the island operated as a primary navigational hub. Its western point, Kialai Kahiki, the way to Tahiti, is positioned with such geometric perfection relative to ocean currents and the Southern Cross that it functioned as the prehistoric version of a modern departure gate at DFW, only with far more reliable scheduling. Despite the island's diminutive size, archaeologists have catalogued nearly 3,000 sites here, including fishing shrines and adze quarries. This was a highly active center of ritual industry, completely defying the descriptions of a barren wasteland offered by later observers who were mostly looking for excuses to ignore it. The ecological apocalypse arrived not with explosions but with a bleat. In 1793, Captain George Vancouver, a man whose botanical diplomacy left something to be desired, gifted goats to King Kahoʻolawe II of Maui. The captain deposited these walking lawnmowers on Kahoʻolawe, where they did exactly what goats do. They multiplied with biblical enthusiasm and ate every green thing that was not bolted to the planet's core. The loss of vegetation led to catastrophic erosion, stripping the topsoil down to the hardpan, a layer of earth so dense it repels water like a waxed car hood. For a time in the 19th century, the island housed a penal colony and later a sheep ranch, because apparently the goats had not entirely finished the job. Vancouver gifted the livestock, and the livestock ate the archipelago. But the goats were merely the opening act for the United States Navy. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the military seized Kahoʻolawe, looked at the sacred body of Kanaloa, and decided it looked remarkably like an enemy aircraft carrier. For decades, the island absorbed a live-fire regime of profound intensity. The landscape became a graveyard of mock airfields and ship silhouettes. In 1965, the Navy conducted Operation Sailor Hat, a title that sounds like a jaunty musical number but was actually the detonation of 500 tons of TNT to simulate a nuclear blast on a warship. The resulting crater is now an ankyline pool inhabited by tiny, resilient shrimp who seem largely unimpressed by atomic physics. This relentless pounding is widely believed to have broken the island's water table, a phrase suggesting the Navy managed to crack the geological plumbing, accelerating freshwater seepage into the sea and leaving the land thirstier than ever. The cultural resurgence of the 1970s collided with this ballistics testing in a moment of necessary friction. In 1976, the Kahoʻolawe 9 made a daring landing to protest the bombing, sparking the formally organized Protect Kahoʻolawe Ohana. The movement gained two tragic heroes in George Helm and Kimo Mitchell, activists who disappeared at sea in 1977. Their loss transformed the struggle from a political dispute into a sacred crusade, effectively shaming the federal Leviathan into submission. Live fire training dragged to a halt in 1990. By 1994, Title X conveyed the island back to the state of Hawaii, complete with a $400 million cleanup fund that proved mostly that explosive debris is much harder to pick up than litter. Today, the Kahoʻolawe Island Reserve Commission manages the territory in trust for a sovereign native Hawaiian entity that does not quite exist yet. It is a reserve in the strictest sense. Commercial activity is banned, and visitors generally cannot step ashore unless they possess a machete, a degree in restoration ecology, and a signed waiver. The cleanup officially ended in 2004. But the math remains sobering. While 3/4 of the surface was cleared of unexploded ordnance, only 10% of the subsurface was swept to a depth of 4 feet. This leaves a quarter of the island as a permanent do not touch zone, a lingering lethality that complicates the replanting of native vegetation designed to heal the soil. The tormented Red Island silently drinks its fractured water table. Yet, just a short distance north across the channels, a completely different vision of environmental intervention was taking shape, one where land would be subjugated not by military explosives, but by billionaire budgets, wellness metrics, and obsessive landscaping. Sensei Lānaʻi, wellness with a reflecting edge. Sensei Lānaʻi does not sit on the beach. It hovers instead in the misty calm of Kahoʻolawe, a region that serves as the island's atmospheric opposite to the sun-baked coast. The structure itself is a study in deletion. The heavy plantation-era decor of the former lodge at Kahoʻolawe, a 1990s attempt to force an English country estate onto a Hawaiian volcanic shield, has been stripped away. In its place, Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison, looking for a laboratory as much as a hotel, and Dr. David Agus, a physician who views the human body as a data set waiting to be optimized, have installed a Japanese-inspired minimalism. The result is Sensei, a wellness retreat where the walls are white, the silence is heavy, and the primary objective is to reprogram your biology. The land remembers the cattle, even if the architects do not. From 1875 to 1951, Kahoʻolawe was the headquarters of the island's ranching operations. It was a muddy, pragmatic hub where beef was the currency rather than cortisol levels. The lodge at Kahoʻolawe eventually replaced the cowboys with concierges, but by 2015 the old-world aesthetic felt like a costume party that had dragged on too long. Ellison purchased the island, closed the doors, and hired Tal Studio to execute a total reimagining. They deleted the Victorian clutter and maximized the light, turning the building into a minimalist frame for the surrounding cook pines and banyan trees. The curriculum here is built on 3 pillars: move, nourish, and rest. In the world of high-end wellness, nouns are essentially forbidden. Only verbs survive. We were told that sensei does not refer to a guru sitting cross-legged on a pillow, but to a guide armed with behavioral science and biometric data. It is wellness by spreadsheet. The move pillar involves functional observations by practitioners who watch you walk and tell you exactly how you have been doing it wrong for 40 years. Nourish is executed at the dining pavilion, a glass box floating over a pond, where the menu is designed to stabilize blood sugar rather than spike dopamine. I wandered into the gardens to investigate the rest component, specifically the onsen experience. These are not mere hot tubs. They are thermal circuits hidden in the foliage. The ritual is prescriptive. A cleanse, a 5 to 10 minute hot soak to dilate the vessels, a punitive cold plunge to shock the nervous system into submission, and a period of rest. It is a very expensive way to replicate the sensation of having a fever and then falling into a frozen lake. But the science insists this regulates the autonomous nervous system. The walk back from the baths revealed the property's most surreal integration. The gardens function as a quiet, unlabeled museum containing roughly $40 million worth of sculpture that has been dropped into the landscape like common lawn furniture. I turned a corner and nearly collided with a monumental bronze figure by Fernando Botero. Further along, a Jeff Koons Aphrodite preened in the foliage. This artistic footprint is the luxury remnant of a project originally pitched as Lānaʻi Lab, a futuristic incubator that intended to include high-tech hydroponic greenhouses known as Sensei Ag. While the wellness resort flourishes, the agricultural arm collided with the logistical realities of island life, specifically high wind and higher power costs, and has since retrenched to focus on the mainland. What remains is the eerie quiet of the pines and the occasional glimpse of the Lānaʻi cat sanctuary in the distance. Lānaʻi in Daddy Ellison's long shade. That re-engineering is immediately visible overhead, under a canopy of trees that look less like terrestrial flora and more like the set design for a film about blue aliens. One begins to understand the scale of ambition at play. These are not saplings that grew gracefully over decades alongside the resort buildings. They are botanical behemoths, 30 years old and fully formed, ripped from ancestral soils in distant countries and dropped into the volcanic uplands of Lānaʻi to provide immediate, mature shade. It is a landscaping strategy, suggesting a level of control over nature usually reserved for terraforming deities or heavy-handed city simulation games. The man casting this very expensive shadow is Larry Ellison, the co-founder of Oracle Corporation and the owner of roughly 98% of the island. Born in 1944, Ellison's journey to becoming a landlord of the Pacific began with a CIA database project in the 1970s codenamed Oracle. He later co-founded the enterprise software giant of the same name and served as CEO until 2014. Wealth bolstered by the artificial intelligence boom allowed him to purchase nearly the entire landmass, 88,000 acres in all, from Castle and Cooke in 2012. He did not merely buy a resort. He bought the utilities, the water company, the main grocery store, and a third of the housing stock, effectively replacing the old plantation bosses with a singular centralized technocracy. A patron at the bar affectionately referred to our benefactor as Daddy Ellison, a nickname that lands somewhere between feudal reverence and a brooding psychological complex. Wandering past the manicured foliage, it becomes clear this is not a standard real estate flip. Unlike developers who slice coastlines into timeshares to turn a quick profit, Ellison has played a game of infinite patience. He rejected the lucrative allure of branded residences, capping the units at Manel Bay rather than expanding them. It is a decision that seemingly leaves money on the table, yet it neatly avoids the density and the bureaucratic horror of homeowners associations that plague other luxury coasts. By owning the checkerboard entirely, he ensures that no minor millionaire can argue with him about the color of the patio furniture. This absolute control dictates the presentation of the surrounding art. Expanding on our earlier realizations about the estate's unlabeled $40 million sculpture collection, we passed the monumental bronze by Fernando Botero again and encountered a cast bronze shark by Damien Hirst. These are museum-grade heavyweights that would usually sit behind velvet ropes and stern guards. Here, they rest exposed to the elements. It is a specific variety of quiet luxury, assuming that if you do not know who Jaume Plensa is by looking at the giant mesh head on the lawn, you probably should not be asking. The curation treats high art merely as landscape furniture, a casual display of dominance that renders a multi-million-dollar sculpture equivalent to a particularly nice hedge. The profound silence surrounding that mesh head is the byproduct of a rare, expensive retreat. Lānaʻi's original grand plan included a push into self-sustaining green energy, featuring Tesla-powered greenhouses intended to revolutionize island farming. But as we noted earlier, the logistical realities of high wind and exorbitant power costs proved difficult even for a man who owns the utility apparatus. The agricultural project pulled back from its initial grandiosity to focus on mainland expansion, leaving those hydroponic dreams somewhat withered on the vine. Yet in this withdrawal, a peculiar victory emerges. The failure to turn Lānaʻi into an industrial agricultural powerhouse only cemented its status as a sanctuary of inefficiency. Losing the battle against the wind depopulated the potential agricultural zones of industrial noise, unintentionally securing the ultimate enclave of silence. The emptiness where the tomatoes were supposed to be is now the resort's greatest asset, proving that in the stratum of extreme wealth, the most valuable thing you can produce is absolutely nothing at all. Standing in that engineered quiet, the manicured pathways eventually yield to darker sightlines. Looking past the imported pines toward the distant channel, the contrast sharpens between a billionaire's optimized retreat and the wider, complicated realities of the neighboring islands resting unseen in the dark. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 9, Wagyu, Ospreys, and Lānaʻi's gold dust gecko. Lānaʻi distills so much of what Hawaii keeps asking you to sit with. The Wagyu is excellent, the gecko is real, and somewhere between the curated art on the Four Seasons walls and the military Osprey doing touch-and-go landings overhead, the gap between the brochure and the place never quite closes. That tension is the story, and it ran through every observation on this island. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon. The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Until next time on The Rise the Limit.